Hello and welcome to episode 18. My apologies for delaying this by a week. I was more tired than I anticipated at the end of last week, and frankly, I let my mental health get the best of me a little bit. And that's something I would like to talk about today. Is in part how I feel my mental health is not an excuse for slacking. I feel that's a very common proponent through much of society. I think many people see their mental health as a reason not to do things, as an excuse to, oh, I'm depressed, so I'll stay in bed all day and surf the internet on my phone, looking at memes that reinforce the idea that depression is normal and okay, which then in turn perpetuates the depression because it's normalized the depression that it's quote unquote normal and okay. And yes, it does happen. However, it's okay not to be okay. Yeah, sure. However, it's not something you're supposed to just accept. I don't think depression is something you're supposed to accept. In the same way, I don't think anxiety is something you're supposed to accept. In the same way, I don't think anger is something you're supposed to accept. And I think as a result of the rhetoric peddled by many components of the media, society has been given this idea that mental health conditions are so normal that it's almost unusual if you don't have a mental health condition. And I think as a result of that, it's caused many people to feel quite alienated for being mentally healthy, which is, I think the mere fact that I've noticed this and feel a need to speak about it is in itself a very serious issue with society. I think most psychological health conditions aren't actually as severe as they're made out to be. And I think some diagnoses are done by medical professionals who don't know any better, and perhaps more significantly, are on the receiving end of financial reimbursement for the diagnosis of medical conditions that can be prescribed certain pharmaceutical objects. So, I've stated before that I believe the media industrial complex and the medical industrial complex are derivative of the military industrial complex. I think establishing the idea of hierarchy is essential to determine responsibility and from that accountability. By positioning the military industrial complex as the highest form within this hierarchy, it provides us a context from which to work outwards from that as our central focus point. I think it's very possible that there might be, it's entirely possible that there's a tier above the military industrial complex. I am as of yet unaware of it, so for the basis of my argument and my research, I will continue with the presupposition that the military industrial complex is the highest form of geopolitical influence on planet Earth. I specify planet Earth because we're aiming to become a multi-planetary species. We have multiple entities aiming to create sustainable settlements on Mars. I don't think we'll stop at Mars. I think it's in human nature to continue expanding towards whatever the goal may be. In this case, it's finding, I guess, arable land, and in placement of arable land, terra firma upon which we can construct artificial farms. I don't know if the term artificial farms is precise enough, however, for the sake of this discussion, I think it conveys my meaning quite well. And I think that the pharmaceutical component of the medical industrial complex, which so something I do with my work is I try and bifurcate everything, and then after I've bifurcated, I try and find a trivium within it. So I understand trivium in its traditional definition refers to grammar, narrative, and rhetoric, and is paired with a quadrumvirate, which was astrology, geometry, mathematics, and music. That's not entirely precise. It is at least 3 parts correct, if not 4, because they were considered fundamental components of education. So, with that in mind, with those 7 main points of linguistics and mathematics, which are the fundamental components of education, everything else is a derivative of linguistics and mathematics, and you could even argue that math is a language and language is a form of mathematics. That by bifurcating the concepts into identifiable terms, it's easy to distinguish the first from the latter. So with that in mind, if you can then bifurcate one of those halves, then you've got 2 quarters and a half. And even if, for example, in the case of the medical industrial industry, if I categorize it as the pharmaceutical, the psychological, and surgical. Surgical to include stuff like cosmetic surgery, however, it's not limited to that. I feel that you could almost argue that pharmaceutical and psychological are the 2 components of probably the psychological health industry, but the pharmaceutical components overlap with the surgical. For instance, anesthesia as well as recovery accelerants? Medicine. So, considering that the pharmaceutical industry and the psychological industry go hand in hand with many of their politically framed arguments, the political framing of mental health as a normalized component of life in the 21st century works to the benefit of those industries. I personally have experienced psychological professionals that saw me as a check rather than a patient, and my experience with pharmaceuticals to help my mental health was honestly more detrimental to my mental health than anything else. It felt like a vampire sucking the life out of me. It really just felt draining on who I was as a person. I didn't feel like me anymore. I felt like I'd been sedated. I didn't feel not feeling alive. I don't mean to be exaggeratory. It didn't feel right. It didn't feel like it was fixing anything. And I tried citralopram, fluoxetine. I know I'm probably mispronouncing that. However, anybody who's familiar with those drugs knows which ones I'm referring to. And I think 2 others. I don't remember the name. One of which I tried for barely a week, and just the transition from the state it was just too horrible. It wasn't worth it. So in fairness, I didn't give that a fair go. The other one, I think I did and didn't enjoy it. And I understand to some degree it's a perception of enjoying life. If you're unable to enjoy life with a prescription medication that's meant to improve your quality of life, and the prescription medication not doing the job, I found that the side effects were so confluently negative that they overwhelmed my ability to do anything much at all. It just took all my energy away from me. And it's one of the reasons I feel that many psychological diagnoses aren't actually illnesses as much as they are responses to difficult stimulus. Becoming angry, anxious, or depressed is actually a very normal part of human life. And there are many a person online that recognise this. And there's a very good meme which I first heard from Duncan Trussell, perhaps on the Joe Rogan podcast. Definitely. I'm not sure which episode it was though. Was that there's somebody somewhere enjoying life by a waterfall that doesn't know how quote unquote angry, anxiety, and depressed they're supposed to be. And it just felt like such a succinct way to describe the effect of the media industrial complex on the population. The amount of people I've seen increasing their screen time without intention, they mindlessly scrolling through something, or they're just opening the app to check on their friend's stuff because they just want to see how their friend is doing, as if that comparison of lifestyle is a way to entertain themselves. I struggle to see how that's considered entertainment if it's not inspirational, because the algorithms in social media and streaming platforms, I think, are designed to the extent, it's designed to the degree with which they capitalize on negative emotion. There's a study which is referenced in a book I'm reading, and I've heard of it before, by Bruno Campanella, Recognition in the Age of Social Media, which refers to Facebook being able to induce emotions in users. That ability to induce emotion simply by an editation to an algorithm, the inference of that says to me that they're basically a social engineering machine. It's a controlled narrative. A digital algorithm is a controlled narrative. So if a digital algorithm is a controlled narrative, with the purpose generally of increasing user interactivity and profit margins, then the narratives by which we're parasocially interacting with see us as nothing more than a tool to profit from or further a political agenda. And then we have to question, is the political agenda that's most forthright on social media, which, let's be fair, tends to be leftism, is a consequence of naturally occurring opinion, or is it the influence of algorithm? Is it a result of algorithmic influence? Pardon me. And I think the hesitation with which people will admit the likelihood that they've been influenced by a digital algorithm is very telling to the degree of which the digital algorithm is functioning very similar to how the drug within an addict system will make them think that the drug is sufficient and there's nothing else they need from life. An alcohol, try to convince an alcoholic they're drunk, or it's not the easiest battle in the world. And it's the same way of trying to convince a social media user that their usage is detrimental to their own well-being. I think the severity with which it takes to impose that argument on people is indicative of the inability of people to separate social media from real life. I was reading recently about how in some cases it's very difficult for the mind to discern real life from, what was the phrasing? Screen-based narrative, in the same sense that it's very, very difficult for the mind to distinguish what's going on from music to audio. And I mean that in a very, I'm trying to create a distinction here. What we hear is music. The brain at some level interprets it as a commentary from within the mind, or perhaps you could argue the voice of God or a higher power, however you want to frame that concept. The concept in question is that the brain cannot distinguish audio in a music-based context from audio in a socialization-based context. So with the continuation of the idea of parasocial relationships becoming almost a norm in some parts of society, especially after the lockdowns from 2020 through to 2022, it to me infers that there's a consistent parasocial relationship development going on, especially in Western society and probably to an extent global society, by which we could, by which humanity is increasingly unable to determine what is real life, and you know, as Mr. Mercury said, is this real life? Is it just fantasy? And considering the development of technologies which blur the lines between reality and fantasy, it's going to become harder and harder for people to know what's real and what's fake. Because when you understand what's real and what's fake, that's a bifurcation in of itself of perception. What am I perceiving is what is real, what is fake. It's being able to establish a personalized narrative is a useful component for determining self-actualization as per Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I understand that freedom of choice is incredibly valuable for any society to remain impartial to the lifestyle of its citizens. Crime notwithstanding, I mean, the idea of crime is a very subjective thing in itself. Paying taxes is technically crime in some people's perspective. So, with that in mind, the industrial complexes we share at home with are part and parcel of the problem and the solution. And therein is, and it's not a false dichotomy, because to some extent the military-industrial complex is necessitated because we fought wars, and we cannot confirm yet whether or not there is extraterrestrial life form in this solar system, in this galaxy. For all we know, multidimensional beings are a real thing and will visit us at some point, or have visited us, and for all we know, we might become the first multidimensional species. Either way we perceive that possibility, the idea of defense as a notion arguing its essentiality is a delicate balance of the right to self-defense as per the United States Second Amendment and the inference of, if we're to be a peaceful society, what do we need weapons for? Well, the origination of weapons, I think, was as a means of tools for the use of hunting. Now, you could argue that we don't need to hunt things anymore. Well, it's because we've gotten so good at hunting, we've developed farms. Nowadays, hunting is more of a hobby than it is anything else. But when you've got a farm, like, why go hunting? I mean, if you enjoy archery and you enjoy shooting, I get it. Like, and if you haven't ever fired a rifle or any other firearm, or I don't know the collective term for bows and arrows and for bows and crossbows and stuff, maybe it's just bows. It is very good fun. There is something very satisfying about hitting a target from increasingly further distances with a maintained precision, especially a moving target. There's a skill to it. The mastery of that skill is an enjoyable pursuit. And I think demonizing such a pursuit is indicative of, I have a personal philosophy which I think is fairly objective in its reasoning, that most people that disparage the merits of somebody else's pursuit without objectively measurable reason behind it, for instance, which sports are better, there's a degree of subjectivity there. However, I would argue that the sports that I enjoy are better than your sports for the pure reason that I enjoy my sports. I think they're better for my purposes. That's not to say that they're inherently superior. It's to argue that I enjoy my sports and I will defend the merits of my sports because they're the sports I do. I wouldn't defend them, I wouldn't choose them if I wasn't willing to defend them. In the same sense that the friends we make in our lives are people we are willing to defend. And for any younger, without meaning offense or more naive listeners and viewers, if your friends aren't willing to defend you, they might not be your friends. It, you know, depends on the case. If you've done something understandably objectionable, for instance, you stabbed one of your friends, then yeah, perhaps they're not going to defend you. However, let's say for whatever reason you've been falsely accused of something, the friend that defends you is the friend. Those that accept the public rhetoric without coming at least to speak to you and understanding it, are probably not your friends. It's that's kind of how friendship works, is you're willing to defend the person. Now I understand that there's such things as fair weather friends, and fair weather friends will exist throughout life. However, every once in a while you find somebody who genuinely has your best interests at heart. And their measurement of your best interests are a combination of their experience and perspective of how the world is and how the world will be, as well as what they perceive your personal highest ideals to be. And that combination of confluence of consideration of ideas, a little bit of an overstatement, however, is essential for a friend to be determined a friend and not just a pal, you know, a buddy and chum, mate, acquaintance is, I would say, the form term. And it's fine to have buddies. You know, it's part of what makes life more manageable. Every, you know, every artist, scientist, athlete, everybody at some point has encountered people that they get along well with in the gym or the library or the workplace that, you know, outside of they're not that fussed about. And that's fine. That's okay. Part of it is developing a civil society by which we both benefit by our cooperation. So by coordinating our efforts in a mutually advantageous manner, everybody wins. We don't have to like each other so much we become best friends. We do, however, have to respect each other enough to be able to study, train and work together in a proactive and productive manner. Because you can be incredibly proactive about things without necessarily being productive. And you can be productive without being proactive. It's the combination of both that helps drive progression. Progression in itself has become quite a loaded term in modern parlance. So in this sake, I would say measurable progress. And I think that social values as a terms of measurable progress is in itself, that's like leaving a loaded gun pointed. You know, it's like leaving a loaded gun on the children's table. Yeah, some kids might be able to pick it up the right way around and not be a muppet about it. However, you've got to provide context for what you're doing. So for instance, if we compare economically measurable progress, brilliant, and then you counterbalance that with, okay, so we're doing all these things, we decided if we're not going to run a purely Austrian free market, pure meritocracy economic model, then whichever degree of regulatory interference we choose to abide by, we have to make sure that there is enough convergence of agreement from those who are experienced enough. Qualifications matter, however, you gain experience via qualifications and actually doing the thing. In theory and practice are the same. In practice and theory differ. And this ability to distinguish self-defense from grandstanding or flexing is often the idea, is I think a really important idea, and I think that distinguishment between grandstanding and self-defense is really an important part of understanding your own mental health. Many people I found that have lower confidence struggle to defend themselves because their self-esteem has been damaged to such an extent that they don't feel worthy of being defended by anybody that isn't going to defend them for them. And I think that's perpetuation of a victim complex. Because if you feel genuinely incapable of defending yourself and you rely on the defense of others to protect you, then that's a victim complex in the making, because eventually the person that's consistently being defended by others is going to understand that they're going to be defended by others, in the same way that a welfare state will eventually teach people they don't need to work because the welfare state is going to look after them. And if people believe that, then you create a cultural issue which then gets passed on generationally. And if it gets passed on generationally, then you've created a cultural problem which then enters the wider culture throughout the entire population to such an extent that people aren't going to want to work. A welfare state that continues increasing the amount of support available for citizens is going to be to the detriment of its future economic prosperity, because that's why communism doesn't work. Because if you create this welfare state, you eventually discourage everybody from working, because why should they work when somebody else is going to pay for everything for them? There's definitely something. I've never shied away from conspiratorial or controversial topics, because I think if you're going to be an academic with integrity, or just a human being with integrity, you cannot shy away from topics that are conspiratorial or controversial. Now, to discuss conspiratorial things with the intent of committing crime, there's a nuance there which will deviate from the argument I'm making. The controversial point I was going to make was to do with the dating scene, that I've noticed there are a staggering amount of women, and this is from my experience as a man. I'm sure there's issues going from women to men that I'm not quite as privy to, but from the experience I have, there are many women that almost see men as monetary opportunity than they do as a life partner, and that's something that's, I think, in part a result of the perpetuation of a welfare state. Because if you create a welfare state that rewards inactivity, pardon me, then citizens are going to take inactivity as a virtuous norm, which then in turn, I think, reinforces the proposition I've made that opinions become philosophy, become politics, become religion. And the idea that if you held this opinion for so long that nobody's be able to prove you wrong on, so, well, why should I work? They keep paying for me. Why should I contribute to society if they keep paying for me? Eventually, you could argue there's a sense of entitlement there, which is probably another issue of possibly the welfare state, because if you don't have to work for the money, then you haven't earned the money. And if you haven't earned the money, you become entitled to something. And entitlement is kind of, I don't know if it's purely opposite to earning things, but the sense of entitlement is definitely an inverse property to earning things. And I think, in reference to the mental health points I've been making so far, are the more entitlement a society perpetuates, for example, universal healthcare. Now, personally, I think universal healthcare is a useful thing, because as soon as you assign monetary value to universal healthcare, you're assigning value to lives. And I personally do believe that some lives are worth more than others because of the contribution to society. Take for instance the billionaire tech entrepreneur who's able to consistently provide value to society at the most economically reasonable price he can justify to maintain the life standards he's, contractually obligated to provide for his employees and contractors, is worth more to society than the homeless person that just sits around all day waiting for someone to chuck some change in their, receptacle for the sake of, buying some cigarettes. To me, there is a difference in societal value. I think that from the moment of birth, I think everybody should be afforded equal civil rights. I think that's kind of the idea of our society. What happens as people age is in large part a result of parenting. And I think parenting's influence on mental health is a hugely willfully ignored component of the equation. I think there are many mentally ill people that would have probably been fairly healthy, if not very productive members of society, had their parents been psychologically healthier. And that in part comes from the values instilled in them by the society they've grown up in, as well as the previous generations, and the familial influence that comes with that. So, in relation of the pharmaceutical points I was making earlier, the perpetuation of a society that considers well-adjustment to illness to be a mark of health. There's an Indian fellow who said it originally. I can't remember his name. Very smart man. And if I wasn't bound to keeping this up, I'd look up on my phone. But honestly, that quote is fantastic, and I really want to give credit to who said it. To be well adjusted. Jiddu Krishnamurti is who the quote is. It's who I understand it to be attributed to. If it's incorrect, please correct me. However, Jiddu Krishnamurti. Jiddu Krishnamurti. Jiddu Krishnamurti. It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. Okay, so let's say you do have a mental health condition, alright. Why are you letting that interfere with your capability to do what you want to do? Why are you letting your mental health condition be an excuse? Why are you not letting it be something that you use to your advantage? And I don't mean that in an exploitative way. I mean, for example, let's say you've got somebody who has ADD. Why not capitalize on that ability to very quickly switch between sources of stimulation to study many things simultaneously that have confluence in their utility. So for instance, if you're interested in business to any degree, then somebody with ADD who looks at all the various components of running a business, from accounting through to HR, through to legal, through to marketing, through to everything else, they're going to understand all these bits and bobs. So that connects here, that connects there, and just all these dots that come on together, until eventually they're able to read a business so well that before they even walk in the front door, they know how well the business is doing, because they understand the patterns that are representative of a profitable business, the patterns of a socially driven business, and the patterns of a failing business. Because once you understand those patterns, because everything at its root is pattern recognition, whether it's linguistics or mathematics, you're then able to recommunicate that information from however the input was communicated to you to other people, and then pass that information on. That's teaching in some way. And I think a large part of the mental health conditions that many components of society face is a result of not being willing to accept the objective measurement of not being willing to accept their own part in what they're doing. Some people are depressed because they're not doing anything. Everybody has responsibility for their own health. The only people you could make a reasonable argument for against that are babies up until they're able to walk and talk with any degree of autonomy. Autonomy might be the incorrect word there. When kids are like 5 or 6 years old, they're usually, sometimes when they're 4 years old or younger even, they're usually smart enough to understand what's going on and respond to the influences around them. So for instance, if you encourage a 4-year-old child to eat healthily, they will understand that is a contextually virtuous behaviour, and they will continue that behaviour, and as they go older, they'll be they're all going to McDonald's, I'm going to get something a little bit healthy. I'm going to get some freshly cooked chicken breast or some nice fish and create a salad at home and create my own meals instead of just succumbing to the peer pressure that everybody else is doing. And the thing is, if you want to socialize people who refuse going out other than McDonald's, well then, why not, stop at a shop somewhere else on the way and eat with them, or find the healthiest option on that menu if you really absolutely have no other choice. There is always a means to navigate the terrain, and I think that assertion of willpower at the expense of social acceptance is actually a really indicative part of what happens to people's mental health. Because by disrespecting yourself in the interest of social acceptance, you normalize behaviors that damage your own self-worth. And by damaging your own self-worth, you fuel into the depression. It's hard for me to say outright that depression is most people's own fault. I think it's very, very foolish to infer that depression is entirely not the responsibility of the patient. And I think by encouraging the patient to accept responsibility for their misdoings and provide them guidance on how to correct those misdoings, because sometimes it's not obvious, If you've never been shown how to balance a checkbook, you might not be able to intuitively figure it out. So, in the same way, if you've never been told that your personal hygiene is actually contributive to your mental health, you might not realize it straight away because you don't know any different. Because one of the issues of depression is this kind of, I would say it's momentum based, because the momentum from depression can make it harder to get out of the depression. And I think it's actually a really useful idea to think of a depression as a cyclical behavior rather than a linear trajectory, because the road to recovery isn't a simple ladder you just climb up, rung. It's not just a simple ladder you take. It's not just a staircase you go step by step. It's a cycle. You will have good days and you will have bad days. And on the good days, you have to capitalize and you have to make hay while the sun shines. And on those bad days, it's going to be a harder fight. But it's those days where it's hard to get out of bed because you've slept less hours than you can count on one hand, and you've not eaten enough, or you've not eaten well, or you haven't spoken to anybody you care about in a while, or you haven't got anybody to care about that to speak to at all, and it's raining outside, and your means of transportation there's a fault in the network somewhere, and there's all these various hardships. You have to overcome that. If you allow those things to become an excuse for you not to do something, then you're enabling the excuses to take precedent in your lines of thinking. And if your means of thinking enable excuses as an acceptable discourse of action, then you're perpetuating your own misery voluntarily. And I think there's a degree of egotism in some people that makes it difficult to accept their own culpability in what's happened to them. The egotism that's, I think, become quite prevalent as a result of algorithmic influence upon digital algorithmic influence upon biological culture is, to such an extent, it blinds people to their own arrogance. And I'm imperfect. I'm sure at points I've behaved arrogantly without intending to, and I think probably a few times would intending to, because I felt I wouldn't be listened to otherwise. However, by recognizing when I'm thinking egotistically and when I'm thinking proactively with long-term ideas in mind, then I encourage the thought patterns in my brain to think more productively, because ultimately it does boil down to physics. So the biophysics of how a human brain operates are in large part to do with the biomechanics of how neurons communicate through action potentials and the pathways that they form, as well as the biochemical influence of external input. So if you're drinking, I don't know, a litre of vodka every day, eventually your body's going to start thinking, oh, I need alcohol. That's a biomechanical level because it's been programmed to thinking that alcohol is the fuel, that's the good thing. In the same way that if you remove alcohol from that system, the brain will struggle to function without it because it doesn't know what to do to replace it with. And at the same time, the physical dependency issues that come with something such as alcohol will make it even more difficult for you to fight out of it. However, anybody that's ever worked any kind of 12-step program or recovery program to be more, just a recovery program, knows that the program works if you work the program. When you work the program works. If you dismiss it as, I'll take a day off, I'll take it easy, then you have to be honest with yourself. It's any addict in any stage of recovery has to be honest with themselves before they can go any further. And it's one of my favorite quotes is from Jordan Peterson, and I'm bastardizing it slightly, bear with us, is you have to stop lying before you can tell the truth. And understanding when you're lying unintentionally, because it can look very subtle, you should never, and I mean, pardon me, never underestimate the ability to lie to yourself. Ever. Because people will justify and rationalize and explain away all these tiny little things that make them feel better about why they're not where they want to be in life. Oh, people don't like me. Okay, either make them like you or deal with people not liking you. 2, oh, I haven't got the money to do that. Okay, so go find a way to earn more money or find a cheaper way to do it. Oh, I haven't got the time to do it. Find the time or ask somebody else to do it for you. There are ways to do this, and it's not exploitative to take advantage of the resources that are afforded to you. Because if you are a respectful person and you ask people with respect and compensate them correctly, for not overpaying, not underpaying, what they're worth, you will start to see that there is a system of economics at play in everything we do. You can call it relationship economics, you can call it socioeconomics. That title is relevant academically. In the actual instance of it happening, it is not a relevant marker. The point stands that there's an economic issue at hand every time you wake up, because there's an opportunity cost to whether or not you get out of bed that day. As soon as you wake up, you have entered the game. Whether you chose to or not, you woke up. So do you want to keep waking up? Okay, so maybe it's in your interest to get up that day. Maybe it's in your interest to stay up that day. Because waking up can be difficult. I know. The amount of times I've woken up and just seen my phone and just went, oh, I'm going straight back into bed. And I've known that if I'd woken up earlier, I'd have had 3 hours more that day to do whatever I wanted. And yeah, sometimes all you want to do is sleep, and rest is a necessary part of training. I get that. However, there is a fine difference to be found between resting and wasting time. There's only so much rest a human being needs, or any entity. You know, if you're training your dog and you discipline them every day, they get the idea of it. But if you're taking your dogs out to the track and running them ragged until they cannot move anymore, eventually they will get injured. And then you will have no dog to run with unless you have a puppy mill going, in which case your disregard for human life is a conversation component will come to some other point. It's the regard for your own life is, if you were caring for somebody that was going through what you're going through, how would you help them? What would you say? Because I think to some degree people need to be tougher on themselves. There's that old discussion point, oh, this next generation, these young generations are so soft compared to us, they've had it so easy. That's kind of the point of technological, it's kind of the point of development, is to make it easier for ourselves and our future generations. And I agree to some extent the facilitation of simplifying life, as it were, has almost devalued life. Because if life was so easy that you can wake up, click a few buttons, and that's your entire life sorted, you've devalued the purpose of waking up. So you have to have a reason to wake up. Okay, well, what's your reason to wake up? Do you want to be alive? No, well, and please pardon me for saying this logically, if you don't want to be alive, kill yourself. If you don't want to kill yourself, you still want to be alive. Okay? That's not meant to insult, it's not meant to offend, it's not meant to upset. It's meant to be an absolute reduction of complexity to the simplicity of the point at hand. Is if you really want to kill yourself, you can go kill yourself. If you do not, you figure out how to stay alive. If you want to stay alive, then find things that make you want to stay alive. And then from there, you climb the staircase. Okay, so I feel alive when I do activity A. Alright, let's go do activity A. Is activity A making me want to stay alive? Oh, no. It makes me feel alive, but it doesn't make me want to stay alive. And I'm referring to this in point of substance abuse such as alcoholism. Yeah, maybe it makes your life fun whilst you're doing it, but if the hangover is never worth it, was it worth it in the first place? I'd argue no, because you regret the behavior. So if you regret the behavior, maybe you need to stop doing the behavior. And this is one of the components that I think enables poor mental health, is people are unwilling to admit their culpability in perpetuating their own misery. Some people don't have shit lives because they're depressed. Some people are depressed because they have shit lives. And I'm going to fairly accredit that quote to Andrew Tate because it's where I heard it first. And as much as I may disagree with some of his views on the world, and I'm sure there are other people, I'm not trying to virtue signal my dislike of Andrew Tate here. He made a very valid statement. Some people's lives are shit because they're depressed. Some people are depressed because their lives are shit. Okay? And it's okay. Maybe you just need to admit to yourself that you don't like your life. That's all right. Because as soon as you admit there's a problem, you can solve the problem. And it frustrates me that people are so willfully ignorant to their own misfortune. And again, more quotes from Andrew Tate, which I will fairly attribute because credit where it's due. He was saying the three biggest problems he sees in most people are arrogance, laziness, and stupidity. I personally edit that to arrogance, laziness, and willful ignorance. Because some people are just kind of dumb. Some people are kind of smart. That's the way it is. Okay? You're born with the genetics you have. And if you can't modify those genetics, then you have to accept what you have and work with it, play to your strengths, or strengthen your weaknesses. Those are the objective options available. And if you... It can be very difficult to determine when you're being arrogant and what's just an assertion of confidence. However, maybe you need to explore within yourself, and maybe you need to adventure within your own psyche to discover what you find to be arrogant. What do you personally define as arrogance? Are you behaving in what you would define as an arrogant way? Okay, yes, no, maybe. When you see arrogance in other people, if you can't spot it in yourself or are struggling to identify it, because sometimes it's not easy, it's the quote that sometimes gets attributed to, I want to say it was Plato, I think it happened earlier, was some people cannot see. Some people will see when shown, and some people can see. Okay, so maybe you can't see it. Okay, fine, admit that, and look at somebody where you can see what you determine to be arrogance. And then, through an established continuation of that, if they're really being arrogant, maybe you need to understand what you perceive as arrogance and what you perceive as confidence. And if that sounds difficult, yes, if it was easy, you wouldn't be needing to do it, would you? You'd have already mastered it and it would be easy for you. but it isn't easy because you haven't done the work yet. You can't go to the gym on your first day, even if you want to participate in extracurricular nutritional activities. To be very polite about it, direct way is steroids. Not my thing. If you want to do that, you still need to go to the gym to maximise the results. You can take steroids and not exercise whatsoever, and sure, you probably will put on some muscle. However, it's not necessary, and you'll have much better results if you actually do the workout. So, given that steroids are a luxury that most people can't afford and just don't need in their lives because improper usage actually causes more harm than good, it's a science which, the biochemistry, which is not the point we're talking about now. You just go to the gym and expect to get in shape by walking through the front door. You have to pick an exercise, do the exercise, and eat and sleep. In the same way, you can't just walk into the library and expect to understand the topic. You have to find the book, open your notepad, and study. Study is reading and writing. That's it. It's not that complicated. Developing methods of study can become complex, but complexity is a relative term. It's only complex to you. It's not complex to everybody else. It's not. What's complex to me might be simple for you, and what's simple for you might be complex for me. That's just part of being human. In the same way that take the most advanced carnivore evolution examples on the planet, whether they're aquatic, land-based, or aerial, there is a hierarchy of capability which comes from the practice of hunting. I enjoy watching nature documentaries because, well, they're pretty cool. I like watching animals do their thing. You know, just living their lives. I watched one recently with leopards, and the example, there was two leopard cubs from this mama leopard, and the female of them was very observant during the hunting. It wasn't quite as confident personality-wise, but was very observant and became a better hunter. And the cocksure male, in that example, didn't pay as much attention apparently and struggled to feed himself because he wasn't paying attention. He wasn't putting in the work. As soon as you put in the work, genders aside, that shit does not matter. If you're complaining about a society that, oh, they're being racist, oh, they're being sexist, oh, they're being classist, oh, they're being, collective term, elitist in some way, shape or form, that stuff exists and it's going to stay here until we learn to overcome it as a society. And that any societal movement begins with the individual. If you can't understand that the racism against you is it's just a hurdle you need to jump over, or the sexism or any other form of elitist rhetoric, that it's a challenge for you to overcome. I'm not saying we shouldn't be working together more as a team to do it. I'm saying it begins with the individual. And if you set the example of what you do not accept as respectful behaviour, you then set precedent for what the people that observe your acceptance of respectable behaviour to be. For instance, if you're in the workplace and you just take whatever they throw at you all the time and don't complain about anything, and you do that to a high enough standard, people will notice your work ethic. And if they're not, maybe you need to play that political game of office politics. I don't enjoy office politics any more than the next person. I like the idea of constructing a strong narrative to argue meritocracy in the same way that in a medical context for mental health, you need to be able to understand your own thought processes and thinking patterns, which are either working advantageously or detrimentally. Because if something's working to your detriment instead of to your advantage, then you need to address the behaviour and correct it. And it's something I see so frequently in societies. People aren't willing to accept responsibility for their own circumstances. They'd much rather absolve themselves their responsibility, or at least, if you can't handle responsibility, find someone and compensate them for it instead of expecting them to do it for nothing. It's why I'm so pro-capitalist, because capitalism is a mimetic evolution of survivalism. It is based on meritocracy. And any capitalistic society that doesn't enable meritocratic values is bastardizing capitalism. For example, take any state that discriminates against anybody for any reason. Instead of getting specifics of it, just discriminates in their hiring policies. If their hiring policy is discriminatory because of your suitability for the role, let's say, for example, the example I tend to use here is if you want to become a firefighter and you're a quadriplegic, not a good fit. It's a form of discrimination that is to the advantage of the fire service, because if you are a quadriplegic, you cannot lift a fire hose, you cannot drive a fire engine, you cannot carry bodies out of a burning building, you are not fit for purpose. The purpose of the firefighter is to be a physically active person who can perform those responsibilities. That's just the fact of the matter. The discrimination based on other things beyond the person's control, such as ethnicity and gender, those situations happen. Are you genuinely the best fit for the role? And if you aren't, do you really want to receive the role because somebody says, we need more women around here because a government quota or regulatory body says we need more women around here? But what if the women applying for the role, and I'm aware of the context here, I think it's because I'm a man looking at women and stuff, so it doesn't matter if you're male, female, transgender, non-binary, I don't know all the terms, so please bear with us. It doesn't matter what your gender is. If you are not fit for the role, you shouldn't be given the job. In the same way, ethnicity-wise, it doesn't matter where you're from or how you identify or however we're categorizing it nowadays. If you're not the best fit for the role, you shouldn't be given the job. And that's, I think, something which many people don't like accepting. I'm not against removing discrimination from hiring policies. If anything, I'm quite the opposite. I want everybody to have the best fit possible so they find the job that they get the most satisfaction from, as well as the companies receiving the best employees to get what they want out of life. Because that's kind of the whole point of having this system. If you are hiring people on political reasons, then you best be able to justify your political reasons. For instance, what's coming to mind is I do the parkrun jog locally every Saturday morning, and the cafe that's very close to the place, person I'm fairly sure is the manager, there are a lot of he's probably in his 40s or 50s, there are a lot of, I'm going to say objectively, attractive young women working there and not very many young men. That's his hiring policy apparently. Those are his politics. If those people are genuinely the best fit for the job, and anybody who's ever worked in hospitality, especially in an alcohol-based hospitality business, understands very clearly that if you have very physically attractive bar staff, whether they be male or female, you're going to get more people to spend money because that's what people do. Pretty privilege and halo effects are a thing. If an attractive person tells you to buy this product or buy this service, you're more likely to listen to them than if you were to be told that by somebody you don't find attractive. It's a fact of the matter. And you can argue pretty privilege all you want. Yeah, pretty privilege is a thing. How about instead of whinging about it and wanting to change beauty standards, you accept what's seen as beautiful? This is in context of a combination, I think, between the meat industrial complex and the medical industrial complex, is what I remember being called the healthy at every size movement. I don't know if it's been renamed these days. I think sometimes it's called fat acceptance. I am not objecting to anybody living the life that they feel will make them happiest and bring them the most fulfillment. I am, however, against people abusing their bodies and expecting other people to fix it for them. I think that's a sense of entitlement. It's in the same way that if you abuse your mind to such a degree that you expect all your friends to be your soapbox, maybe you need to start treating your mind better. In the same way that if you abuse your body consistently and expect all your friends to become your surgeons and therapists, physiotherapists, pardon me, maybe you're not being a good friend. Maybe if you are, I mean, BMI is a terrible metric. I'm technically obese, even though I'm not obese in a adipose tissue sense. I have a fair amount of muscle mass. I'm trying to say that without being a knob. The point I'm making here is accepting responsibility for the actions we've made upon ourselves. And I think that's a consequence of encouraging the welfare state throughout society. And I think the welfare state can be summarized as end-state communism. The thing is, though, if you follow end-state communism, how does the stuff get made? If nobody's working, then there's no production. If there's no production, then the industry will grind to a halt. And surprisingly, I've had to explain this more than you'd think. You really need to. When production grinds to a halt, society stops. And when society stops, people die. And when people die, the system of governance has failed. Because the system of governance, as far as I'm aware, is supposed to keep people alive. That's why I have a personal view, which I think is fairly founded on objective analysis and evaluation of communistic society, is that most people who are pro-communist don't know enough about communism to be pro-communist, or think they'll be in charge. I'm still... Okay, in the interest of being honest with myself and continuing, because it's a thought pattern process, I'm still a little bit bitter about the girl I found attractive who turned out to be a communist. So I was speaking to her about it, and I'm trying to maintain the objective principle with which I'm speaking. So the woman I was speaking to, I mean, intellectually you could consider her a girl instead of a woman if she thinks communism is a good idea. However, let's calm down there. The fact that she was espousing communism as a functional way of governing society, to me, reeks of elitism and entitlement. Because, as per Thomas Sowell's opinion, most people that espouse communism as a good idea are rich and privileged. They haven't experienced what happens when you're actually, fighting for every single goddamn penny. And that's the tricky thing, is when you make a more prosperous society, it becomes that cycle of... The original quote was hard men, but we can update that. Hard people make good times make soft people make bad times make hard people. It's a cycle. And I think understanding that cyclical nature and applying that logic to your own mental health, if you are in tough times and you become a harder person, you will have better times. And if you allow those better times to make you a soft person again, then you will go down instead of up. And I think that's relative to all components of medicine. If you look after your physical health, then your mental health will improve. If you improve your mental health, your physical health will improve. They are directly interlinked. Right. I think that covers most of my thoughts and feelings on that topic. Hope you've enjoyed that one. As I promised, I will be doing 2 hours today instead of my usual hour. So I'm going to have my protein shake, and we will then move on to whatever apparently comes to mind for the next one. As a PSA, I tend to drink full fat milk because I'm a bit large and it helps make calories easier into my body. For anybody else who also enjoys protein shakes with milk, although my work will also as well, milk, peanut butter, and I found that certain peanut butters are mixed better than others, so you might need to trial and error that a bit. Milk, peanut butter, Greek yogurt to change consistency, 2 raw eggs, which they agree with your stomach. Honestly, most people think it's a bit gross. It's really very easy to digest. Plus, I put 1 scoop of my protein powder. Honestly, God, it's delicious, it's nutritious, it's filling. Highly recommend to everybody listening. Right, without further ado, on to round 2. Okay, so we did a Sicilian defense before. Shall we try something different? I don't hate the French defense. I'm not super great at playing French defense, but then I do better at playing. What do you remember about the French defense? I also really like the Sicilian defense and I'm good at the Sicilian defense. As for Bruce Lee, fear not the man who knows 10,000 kicks, but the man who's practiced one kick 10,000 times. So, let's see what happens this time. What do we need to speak about? I mean, this is my show, I can talk about whatever I want, really. Well, let's talk about my life a little bit. Studying, training, working. Without a prompt from you guys, it's... I can check the chat. I'm just going to think about whatever I feel is worth thinking about. And to be quite honest, okay, here's an art. It's something I've noticed quite frequently. Pardon me. Pardon me. Is the amount of people who willingly engage in gossip for little other reason than social validation. And it makes me wonder, I think it's consequential of social media's influence upon society rewarding, I mean, you've got the comment button, you've got the like button, you've got the share button. I think as a consequence of social media's ability to, I mean, you could argue that conversations are form of social media because it's socialization, and then the media through it is just conversation. Medium is the message. And I think the insistence in talking about gossip as opposed to utilitarian ideals, that might be a little overly politically mentioned, just being useful. It's, in part, it might be one of the fundamental differences between men and women is men tend to be slightly more practical in their understanding of the world, and women tend to be more emotionally tuned. I understand that that's seen somewhat as, it's almost seen as a negative stereotype these days, and I think that's kind of preposterous. It's, if anything, it's complementing the ability of the differences between the sexes, and I understand that my personal view is that there are two sexes, but there are multiple genders. So, with there being two sexes, male and female, and there's multiple genders, which are expressions throughout them. Biologically, that's, as far from where, that's how it works. And I think any biologist that says otherwise has usually got some kind of motive to it. And I think anybody that believes scientists to be morally above the corruption that we assume in politicians is naive and foolish. To assume that anybody is uncorruptible is ridiculous. I'm sure at some points I've been corrupted without even realising it. In some sense, that I do my best to be as Puritan with my integrity as possible. However, we're not perfect. And none of us ever will be. And I think the insistence that any of us are perfect the way we are is in of itself a delusion. Because if you really think you're a perfect, whatever scoring system you're using, it might be 10 out of 10, 100 out of 100, billion out of billion, whatever that scoring metric is, if you really think you're perfect, then you're holding yourself to effectively be God, or something so evolutionary or technologically advanced that you'd be basically emperor of the world, indisputably, and nobody would ever disagree with you in anything because you're perfect. So I think this idea, and I think in part it does attach to the idea of the beauty standards movement, is you're not perfect, and that's okay. Accept your imperfections because they're yours. It's just you being you. You get to be you. That's one of the great parts about being alive, is you get to be you. And identify however you want to identify. I'm not here to tell you not to do that. I don't think it's anybody's place to tell you what to do unless you've agreed contractually to do that for them. The idea of just gossiping about everything doesn't make much sense to me. It feels like a way to nurture societal preferences and in turn perpetuate nepotism. It forms an in circle, and as soon as the in circle is created, there's a distinction between in and out. And if you're in the circle, then you're served by benefiting the system. It's the status quo, as it were. And okay, cool, you're benefiting the system, but are you actually benefiting the system because it's benefiting you? Or are you perpetuating a divide between who's in and who's out of the system for the sake of the people who are also in the system? It's in some ways it's a form of loyalty. I understand in some cases you want to showcase loyalty, and at the same time, if you're deliberately excluding people from your system because you feel that that's what's necessary to display your loyalty, you have to question why the exclusatory practice is in action. Now, if it's a simple case of admission standards to an education facility, let's say, for example, I've made it known that I want to study at Oxford University after I graduate from the University of Reading. I have to meet their admission standards, which are a first class degrees honours, and I'm also doing extracurricular activities such as the Red Award, the Star Mentoring Award. I'll be joining the basketball team with the intention of working up to captain and or coaching, as well as being interested in the politics society. To get into a school of the tier of the University of Oxford, you have to meet their standards, not ask them to lower their standards to you. Because if you raise yourself to meet their standards instead of asking themselves to lower their standards, you become better, and the facility you're joining, which in this case I'm joining the University of Oxford because I'm intending to join the University of Oxford for, in part, the prestige of Oxford, then I have to continue the prestige. I want to go to the best school in the world because it's the best school in the world. If I just wanted to get a master's degree and doctorate in whichever subject I choose, I'd find the easiest admissions on the most lackadaisical course and breeze it all. and be fine. Oh, good. I'm a doctor. Where do you get a doctor from? Oh, this guy down the pub said he runs a school. Oh, really? Does he? Is he accredited? What's an accreditation? And it's like, I want to go to a good school because the education is better, because the teachers have more experience, because the teachers are smarter. It's the objective term for defining a better teacher is a smarter teacher. They have more knowledge, greater intelligence, and more instances of wisdom that's worked for them. As well as when you have people from industry that are guest speakers that deliberately go to Oxford because of the prestige and are invited to Oxford because of their prestige. That's this whole idea of perpetuating equality. It's a falsehood. Equality is a lie. We're not born equal except in the eyes of man-made laws. There will always be somebody weaker than you. There will always be somebody who's stronger than you. In the same way, intellectually, athletically, business efficiency, it doesn't matter which avenue we're looking at it right now. The point stands is you will never be the best at it forever. You might be world champion in your art, your science, your sport for your entire lifetime. And if you are, I salute you. That is very impressive. However, after your death, eventually somebody will supplant you. It doesn't matter what kind of art, science, or sport it is, or business. It's the presently wealthiest man in the world, the presently wealthiest person in the world, will eventually have somebody wealthier than them. The most popular artist in the world will eventually have somebody who is measurably more popular than them. And that might simply be because of population increase. It might be because tastes change. It's hard to measure these things. The most scientifically and useful person ever, I mean, whoever contributed the most variety of fields, or whatever polymath that might be, eventually somebody will surpass them. And that's supposed to happen in the same way. Whatever athletic, I mean, doesn't matter which teams won the World Cup, whether it's in football or rugby or the Olympic sport in equivalent, the Olympic equivalents as well, or who's the greatest boxer, or the greatest grappler or kickboxer. It's all temporary. And as soon as you accept it's temporary, you realise, okay, well, if I'm going to do it, am I really going to do it to the best of my ability with the understanding that I can become world champion in everything I ever do and still be worse than somebody else? And I think that's a really serious point of addressing your own ego, is that can you accept the fact that you will always be worse than somebody? You will never be the best, because there will always be somebody better than you. Winning in itself is an illusion. You can only strive to be less of a loser. And that sounds dumber than it's meant to, but it really isn't. No matter how many times you win, you will eventually be defeated. Because unless you are the most genetically gifted person of all time, in the most financially stable family with access to the most cutting, the absolute foremost technological capabilities to essentially immortalize you, and even then you still got to do all of that. And then if that happens and you choose not to take an heir and pass on those, in this case examples, optimum genetic material, then you just ended the genetic line and quit while you're ahead. But that doesn't mean you cannot be reproduced by a cloning effort, or that somebody else in your family, that somebody else reproduces. For instance, let's say you have a sister, she has kids, or your brothers have impregnate women who have kids with better genetics. Eventually, genetics will improve. That is how genetics progress with it. The human race is getting collectively smarter, because our mating pools are becoming smarter because of our technological advancements. So if you couple that with consistent physiological strengthening, then there's no reason whatsoever that you cannot be replaced. Now, in a subjective context of how much that person means to the individual, to sentimental value, most people are irreplaceable. However, in the context of their objective value to society, as measured by economic remuneration, or arbitrary award assignment, or whatever measurement of success you wish to assign, you are replaceable. And I think that's a huge part of understanding who we are as human beings is it's all temporary, it's all going to burn down eventually. And then you enter the idea of nihilism. It's like, oh, why does it matter? But then you can be an optimistic now. It's like, why can't it matter? Like, why not? Why can't I be the greatest of all time and the absolute best at everything I do and better than everybody around me for as long as I can? Why not? Who's to say that I can? Who's to say that I shouldn't? Absolutely nobody has any right to say that to me whatsoever. Actually, no, they have every right to say that to me, but they have no right whatsoever to beat that into my consciousness to such an extent that I believe it. With freedom of speech comes with freedom of speech from disagreeing opinions, and that's okay. The ability to construct, if your opinion or position, if your opinion cannot be successfully defended, maybe you didn't hold the opinion that strongly in the first place. It's one of the reasons I think that liberalism and other forms of leftism are actually kind of weak structurally, because they require consistent propping up by media narratives. If the media has to consistently argue that your position is superior, maybe it's just not that superior. And the tricky thing is, in some cases, media enforcement of social rhetoric has utility, for example, in overcoming race issues. For example, there are going to be very many people of other races to me who are smarter than me, who are stronger than me, who are otherwise superior in whatever avenue of measurement we choose to assign to ourselves that day. So what? There'll be ways that I'm smarter or stronger than some other people from their ethnicities. That's kind of, by focusing on this, we miss the point. And if anything, it's weirdly an argument for eugenics. And it's very hard to argue for eugenics in a politically correct, well, quote unquote politically correct structure. However, when you're searching for a mate to parent your children, you are thinking eugenically. Because the most attractive person you're looking for is somebody that not just for your own sexual gratification is to imbue your offspring with the optimal genetics you can possibly provide for them. In some ways, medicine is partially eugenic based because it's a perpetuation of genetic material. And if you wish to become a parent, and I encourage you to do so, because why not? It's a great thing. I have a personal view that people who refuse to become parents are usually kind of stunted in arrested development. It's not the scope of this conversation, and I think that I need to fine tune it more before I can express it publicly without sounding like I'm more of a horrible person than I believe I am to be. It's eugenics has been given such a bad reputation that it doesn't do. It's incorrect. Because of the affiliation of eugenics with authoritarianism, it's misrepresentative of what eugenics can be. Because if you're thinking about genetic modifications in the same way that we genetically modify food, whether it be meat or vegetables, that is in a way a derivative of eugenic principles. You want to optimize it for the sake of having the best possible outcome. And I'm not saying exterminate all the inferior people in whatever context of inferiority you're defining. I'm saying, why not make them stronger? What, instead of normalizing weakness, develop systems of strength so that the culture becomes stronger. It circles around to that mental health argument from before. If you want to become mentally healthy, you have to recognize how you're mentally unhealthy so that you can correct the behavior. In the same way that if you do not admit there's a problem, you cannot fix the problem. You have to learn to be honest with yourself. And being honest with yourself can mean saying things to yourself which are upsetting. A lot of the times when I've had to be honest with myself, I've had to insult, offend, and upset myself because otherwise the message wasn't getting through. And I have a very, very strong feeling with some, honestly, near enough 100% certainty that a large proportion of the population needs to do the same. If you cannot force yourself to do something and be strict with yourself, then you lack discipline. And discipline, as per Jocko Willink, equals freedom. Because regardless of whichever avenue or you decide to be disciplined in, you still need to be disciplined. It doesn't matter if you're baking a cake or planting a garden or running a ministry or leading the world. You still need to be disciplined in what you're doing and hold true to the virtues you feel are in the best interest of those you're elected to represent, whether that be the ingredients of the cake, the components of the garden, whether it's purely ornamental or if it's for the sake of nutrition, etc., etc. Whichever system of organisation you choose to be representative of, you have to think with the system's best interest. And thinking in a system's best interest means understanding what aligns in your personal interest isn't necessarily the same. Now, I'm not saying go self-harm. I think that's self-harm is one of the biggest issues in the world. Bigger than any form of elitism. Self-harm and suicide, that's the real villain. Because it affects everybody equally. To some degree, every human being on this planet engages in some kind of self-harm. And sometimes they don't even realise it's self-harm. That's the big villain here, suicide, man. That's the enemy. Suicide is the enemy. I'm just so bored of people justifying their self-righteous suicides. The hashtag chop suey system of a down, Sir Tankin, and Darren Malaki. I don't know who's leading on that song. It was Sarge, wasn't it? No, we're doing both. It's just, come on. At some point you need to accept responsibility for your own behaviours and admit that what you're doing is hurting yourself. I realise that's probably an hour and a half rather than 2 hours. And I did say I was going to do 2 hours. And this is exactly the point of it. Even though I feel like I'm a bit tired, I'm a bit hungry, and frankly, I kind of want to end the episode on that note because I think it's that impactful a note to leave the episode on. I recognise that I made a commitment to agree to 2 hours, and I think that I need to persevere in that because it's what I said I would do, it's what I said I would do, so it's what I'm going to do. And maybe the third conversation topic I bring up here is less interesting. Perhaps it's purely about my personal life. Perhaps everything I've said so far is just a projection of my own personal perception of my personal life. And to some degree it probably is. Because I think that's how everybody speaks. Whenever we speak about anything, no matter what level of communication is, it's an idea I came up with recently, is if double speak is a concept and triple entendres are a concept, then triple speak is a concept, by which inference there's no upper limit to it unless you argue that infinity is impossible. So there can be quadruple speak, quintuple speak, sextuple, septuple speak, octuple, and so on and so forth. It's going to continue, which means if you understand the degrees with which communication occurs, then you understand that the levels with which within you're communicating. Wow, I really have a bad internet addiction. That's 3 times I had a triple W alliteration. If you understand the depth to which your conversational skills reflect your internal mechanisms, the better you're able to function. And this is why I think understanding what economic prosperity means, as well as truly neutral governance in the interest of allowing freedom of choice, which I think is the best collectoral term to describe you know, freedom of movement, freedom of speech, it's like freedom of choice. It's, well, I guess the issue from that then becomes crime. In the, how do you define crime? I have the personal view that there is no such thing as objective crime, only subjective crime. And the first argument that comes to mind against that, so I have an apple, I'm going to eat my apple and then we're going to do this. Well, part of an apple. Is rape. Is rape considered a crime? In nature, murder is not considered a crime because it feeds people. Theft isn't considered a crime because it feeds people. So, and I'd like to make it very fucking clear here that I'm going to make this admittedly controversial statement with the intent of academic discourse. In nature, is rape a crime? Possibly not. There are some animals which rape for the sake of perpetuating their genetic lineage. I'm aware that ducks do it. I've heard that orangutans do. I don't think those are the only animals that do so. So, let's search it up. In the interest of... Oh shit, I got this voice call. That's from a friend who I said, bollocks. Where are we getting to good stuff? Right, I need to take that call. So, is rape a crime? That's a topic of conversation for next week. What I'll do is an hour and a half next week. That'll balance out. I truly apologise for not doing 2 hours today. It's if I want to be a good friend, I have to actually be a good friend for my friend. Thank you everybody for listening, watching. Please comment, like, share, subscribe, everything, all that good stuff. I have a Patreon now. Please, if you'd like to donate to it, I'm more than welcome to. The first tier of it that I put in, you suggest a topic of conversation. Remember, I will talk about anything, and I truly mean anything, and I will do my best to try and steelman it as best as I can. I accept that some of you might have some unusual views. Go for it. Why not? Why not have the conversation? At the very least, we understand that what disgusts me and how I feel about it, even if I can't do as an objective a job as I want to. Thank you very much. Please have as wonderful life as you can. Stop self-harming. Figure out how you're lying to yourself and stop doing it. Love you, bye.